Okay, everybody, welcome back. Sorry, we had some technical difficulties, a string of technical difficulties last night and this morning, but now I'm back to finish off Aristotle. So let's jump right into where we left off. We left off talking about how for Aristotle you can place, you can decide what to do by trying to fix your sight on what the middle path is between extreme reactions to emotions. So the example we used yesterday was with anger. Right? If I give into anger too little, I'm a wimp. If I give into anger if I give into anger too much, I'm a hothead. I'm always blowing my top, right? And if I give into anger just the right amount at the right time, I am assertive. So what you see here is you see a very popular sort of way of visualizing this Aristotle's scheme here, right? So make up a little table where you can think of an emotion, and if you think of giving into that emotion too much, what words come to mind? Well, in this case, for too much, you're a hothead. If you give into it too little, you're a wimp. And if you experience just anger in exactly the right way, which will be a balance between giving too much or too little, we say you are assertive. Right, and we can do this with, Aristotle says, just about any emotion, and he goes on at considerable length proving this point. So let's do just a couple others to illustrate the point. So here we have fear. If you give into fear too much, you are a coward. If you give into fear too little, you're driving down the wrong side of the highway, somebody pulls a gun on you, you grab the gun and put it to your head and say, go ahead, shoot me, right? That's too little fear, that's crazy, right? We call that person rash or reckless. But if you experience fear to the right degree in the right way at the right time, you experience fear, but you don't let it get in the way of you doing your job or doing what's right, we call that person courageous. Pity. Feeling sorry for people. If you pity people too much, you're a pushover. If you pity people too little, you're callous. You don't experience any sort of pity and you don't care about people. But experiencing pity in the right way at the right time to the right person, you are kind. Humor. If you experience too much humor, you're the sort of person who's making knock-knock jokes at a funeral. Aristotle calls you a buffoon. If you experience too little humor, you never get any of the jokes, you never make any of the jokes, you're totally humorless. You're like Sheldon on the Big Bang Theory, you're a bore, right? But if you know how to make the right joke at the right time in the right way, you're not cracking wise at the funeral, but after the funeral, when you go to the bar or you're at the reception with your friends, you tell a funny story about your deceased friend that lifts everybody's spirits, right? We call that person witty. Pride. If you experience too much pride, you're always bragging about yourself, you never doubt yourself at all, you're arrogant. If you have no pride, then you have very low self-esteem, or you have self-doubt, as Aristotle says, right? But if you have the proper amount of pride, you take pride in yourself, but you're not a braggart, and you have a reasonable self-opinion. You're self-confident, right? Now, what is the point of all of this? Well, it has a few points. First of all, Aristotle wants us to notice that. Now, of course, just FYI, we could do this all day. I'll spare you any further examples. But we could do this with just about any emotion you can experience. Aristotle thinks that any emotion comes with the possibility of giving into it too much or too little. And we need to try to train ourselves to hit this middle mark, right? And we need to through that training, develop a habit of avoiding the vices, right? We should, and Aristotle thinks that by knowing this sort of arrangement and thinking about this arrangement, that will help us hit the mark, so to speak. If we know what we're aiming at or what we're trying to do, if you realize that you need to try to be assertive, courageous, kind, witty, self-confident, and so on, then you can think, okay, well, here's what I need to do to try to try to do that, right? Furthermore, Aristotle says we don't need any special. We don't need any. There's no rule or procedure that we can think of that is going to lead us to always hit this middle mark. This is something that Aristotle thinks we just know when we see it. We know an assertive or a courageous person when we see them, and we're naturally drawn or attracted to that kind of behavior. In the same way, we're naturally repulsed by people who demonstrate the vices. We look at those people and say, I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be like that. And Aristotle says this should be your guide as to what to do, right? Think about the kind of person you want to be. Think of the kind of people that you admire, and try as best you can to try to be like them. Therefore, this arrangement is going to be very important that we have the proper role models. It's going to be very important that we have in our lives, or at least in our mind, the people that we want to be. Hopefully there's somebody in your life that is a role model that you can think to yourself, well, what would that person do in this situation? If it's a person, if it's a parent or a grandparent or a family member, you can even call that person up and say, hey, I don't know what to do in this situation. Can you give me some advice, right? That's the ideal, Aristotle thinks, that we would have in our lives an exemplar. Of course, this isn't always possible, right? So hopefully, Aristotle thinks we're going to be able to find exemplars in our society somewhere. If there's not somebody in your family, then hopefully there is somebody who you know who is a celebrity of some kind, who has accomplished something, who is, don't laugh, maybe a politician, right? And you might think to yourself, well, how can I be more like that person? How can I live up to that role model, right? And this is very important, Aristotle thinks. A society that doesn't have these kinds of role models is a society that's going to be dysfunctional. It isn't going to last very long. And I think Aristotle would look at our own modern American society and say that this is one of the things that's probably wrong with it, is that we are exalting and giving respect and esteem to the wrong people. We don't esteem people based on their accomplishments. We don't esteem people based on their demonstration of virtues. We esteem people based on whether or not they amuse us, whether or not they're buffoons, whether or not they're willing to make fools of themselves on social media, and so on. And those are the kinds of people, whether or not they're good looking, those are the kinds of people we tend to, press like for a lot, right? And those are the kinds of people who tend to get the recognition in our society. And we realize, I think, in our modern society, there's something wrong with the sorts of celebrities that we have in this era in American history. Things I point out to my students is, 50 years ago, for my dad's generation, it made sense to ask yourself, what would John Wayne do, right? John Wayne, a famous actor of that era, who had this very manly persona, right? And he was more than an actor. He was kind of he was a type of person, right? And it made sense to ask yourself, what would John Wayne do? And I think one of the things that's lacking in our modern society is those kinds of role models. We don't have many of those. And my father's generation could also say, what would Dwight Eisenhower do, right? What would John F. Kennedy do? These are former presidents who were unabashedly, unironically role models for people of their generation, and they would say those things without smiling, right? And I think that's maybe something that's missing from our modern society, right? Who are the biggest actors today? Brad Pitt. Does it make sense to ask, well, what would Brad Pitt do in a moral situation? Probably not. I don't know Brad Pitt. He doesn't have the kind of persona that somebody like John Wayne does, right? Mostly the people who do have that persona, there's still celebrities who have a certain kind of public persona, but mostly people who project a kind of brand are goofballs, right? They're comedians. We don't take them very seriously, right? No, but I can't think of any celebrity, frankly, who projects a kind of public brand as a role model or somebody that you want to live up to, right? Hard to think of. Maybe some athletes, right? But it's been a big debate in the past 30 years among athletes about whether or not they consider themselves role models and how they live their lives off the field, right? So anyway, so let's now do a quick recap of what we have learned so far, and then settle up some final issues. Okay. So a recap of the basics of Aristotle's theory. Remember, we started out talking about the question, well, what is the good life, right? Well, the good life, for Aristotle, is one that's aimed at happiness. Happiness, according to Aristotle's scheme, is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. That is, it is a movement. It is a movement about the world, a way of going about your life, but one that is in accordance with virtue. And virtue is a disposition to choose the mean, which means that it is a life's habit or an ingrained character trait that you choose the mean. You choose the middle path between the two vices, right? That word disposition there, by the way, I spelled it, no I didn't. Yes, you did. Okay, oops. It's disposition. Anyway, that word disposition, that's a technical term for Aristotle. A disposition is like it's like a habit that has become a part of your personality, right? I'll give an example of this from a familiar example of this is an analogy to exercise and eating well, right? That say your New Year's resolution is to be healthier, right? And this means that you need to exercise more and you need to eat better, right? So you lay out your scheme. You're going to go to the gym at least 3 times a week. You're going to make up your lunches for the week on Sunday. Plan your lunches and your meals for the week on Sunday, and so on. And at first, beginning of January, this is a major drag, right? It's really, really hard to do this, to change your habits, right? But if you keep at it and you keep making yourself do it, then what happens? Well, by February, this has become a habit. These things that you're doing. You just go to the gym. You don't think about it anymore. You don't have to kick your butt to get out of bed in the morning to go in a little earlier, just to go after work or whatever. Sunday night, you're no longer having to force yourself to plan your meals. It's just that's what you do on Sunday nights, right? So you're developing a good habit, right? The next step after that for Aristotle is what he calls a disposition. A disposition will be that whenever the habit has become something that requires no effort at all anymore. It's just part of who you are, right? And this is the point at which you begin going to the gym, stressing out if your routine is upset, right? This is the point at which you begin to lose your taste for the fattier foods and so on, and you really begin to enjoy the taste of tofu and soybeans and so on, right? Healthier foods, right? Furthermore, this is where other parts of your life become affected. Maybe you start reading health magazines more often. Maybe you start hanging out with friends you meet from the gym and going out to lunch with them instead of your friends who just like to go hang, and hit McDonald's or Red Lobster or something for lunch, right? And so the point of disposition is when your habit has really become a lifestyle, right? So and that leads into the next question of, how is it that we become virtuous? If we're not already, for Aristotle, how is it that we become virtuous? We begin this discussion by saying how we don't become virtuous. For Aristotle, the approach that is offered by Kant and Mill, Kantianism and utilitarianism. For Aristotle, that doesn't make any sense. Kant and Mill don't agree about much, but they do agree about this basic position. And their basic position is the point of studying ethics is to find a principle or a set of principles that we can apply in every situation. It's going to tell me exactly what's right and what's wrong, right? So give me an action, give me my little formula, and I can tell you anything in a certain situation. I give you advice on basically anything, right? And Aristotle thinks, well, that's just Aristotle and his people in his lineage believe that that's just wrong, that there is no rule or no set of rules that can perfectly tell you how to be a good person, that it's more like an art than a science, you might say. It involves a lot of hard work. It involves developing good habits and good judgment. And if you don't know how to be a good person, or if you want to know how to be a better person, I think Aristotle's advice would be, well, this is a skill. This is a skill like any other skill. And if you were going to develop any other skill, say you wanted to learn how to play guitar, what would you do? Well, you do a couple things. So let's look at the question, how do we become virtuous? Before we answer this question, the attendance password for today is guitar. Email me the word guitar, and I will count you as present. So, how do we become virtuous? Well, as I said before, Aristotle's advice on this question might be to ask, well, how do you become good at any skill? If you want to learn guitar, for instance, what would you do? Aristotle thinks there are two things you do, fundamentally, right? First of all, you would find a teacher, right? You would find somebody who already knows how to play guitar, and you would go out and you would take lessons from that person and try to emulate that person. So, step one is find a role model or teacher, right? This is, as I talked about before, for Aristotle, the idea of role models, people that we're trying to emulate, people that we can fix our minds on and ask, what would that person do in this situation? That's going to be absolutely crucial to Aristotle's scheme here. And to say just a little bit more about that, we can get, even if you live in a dysfunctional society, as I said that we might right now, even if there's nobody in your personal life who counts as a role model, or who you feel comfortable esteeming with the title role model, you might look to fiction, right? You might look to some novel that you love or some movie that you love, and ask yourself, well, what would that person do? How can I be more like that person? And it really doesn't matter what the source is or what the media is, whether it's a comic book or a video game or anything like that. What matters is that thinking about that helps you grasp what virtue is, and helps guide you, right? So you might ask, well, what would Batman do, right? Or what would Superman do, etc., right? For the Greeks, they of course had extensive mythology, right? And they had all sorts of heroes, from Achilles to Hercules to Jason, Argonaut fame. So all of those heroes managed to be role models, and even if you had nobody in your life, you could ask, well, what would Theseus do, right? The Greeks had gods, but very often the gods were, if you read Greek mythology, they were not role models, and that's an interesting dynamic that existed between Greek mortal heroes and the Greek gods. Is that very often the gods are presented as these very, very petty, very terrifying figures, but the Greek heroes are presented as, well, heroes. Yes. Another thing is, you might have seen the bumper sticker of the T-shirt that says, "What would Jesus do?" Right? Now, this is a great example of a different way of thinking about the same issue. So obviously Christianity provides a kind of a moral system. But how do we think about that system? How do we think about how to apply that system? One way that people think about applying that system is you say, well, I just have to follow the 10 Commandments. If I just follow the 10 Commandments, if I just do that all the time, I'm good. I'm a good person, right? Well, that's a very deontological way of thinking about the Bible, right? Because you're just thinking about, I need to follow these specific rules. On the other hand, somebody in that same church of that same faith might say, well, the way that I approach moral decision making is I ask, what would Jesus do, right? Now, you're very likely to get the same answer to both of those questions. What would Jesus do, and how do I fulfill the, should I fulfill the 10 Commandments, right? Or you're going to get a lot of the same advice. But notice that those are two sort of different blushes on the same question. They're different approaches to the same question. And the asking, what would Jesus do, is a virtue ethical approach to Christianity, right? So to become virtuous, in the first case, you find a role model or a teacher. In the second case, there's no substitute for simply practicing, going out and, if we're talking about playing guitar, you get a guitar, you take lessons, and you practice. And maybe it's boring at first, maybe it's hard to force yourself to play your scales over and over and over again in your room, but eventually it becomes a habit, and then pretty soon you're buying music magazines and hanging out with musicians and forming a band, right? So find a teacher, and then practice. Right. So what does it mean to practice? We know what it means to practice playing guitar, but what does it mean to practice being virtuous? Well, for Aristotle, this means that we need, in the first case, to take stock of where we are deficient, right? We all have a similar complement of emotions, but we have very different dispositions from individual to individual. We have very different ways of experiencing those emotions and degrees of experiencing those emotions, right? So you need to take stock of where it is you're deficient. What are your weaknesses? Where is it that you tend to go too far in one direction or another? Maybe you're very even-tempered, but you're very fearful, right? You have trouble facing scary situations, and you're not a risk taker, right? So Aristotle thinks, well, you need to practice taking more risks then, if that's your problem, right? His advice that if you're a coward, if you find yourself being a coward, his advice is go join the army, right? The army will train you. Aristotle and a lot of the Greeks think the army is a great source, and I think we do today with good reason. Military is a great source of developing a lot of these virtues of hard work, being on time for things, courage, and so on, right? Teamwork. The military is going to be a way of developing a lot of these virtues, and Aristotle thinks, especially when it comes to courage, they'll fix you up, right? If you realize that your problem is you don't feel enough pity, that you don't really care a lot about other people, Aristotle's advice would be, well, maybe go out and help the poor, right? Go volunteer at a soup kitchen or something like that, right? At any rate, we need to take stock of where we are falling short personally from our role models and from our ideal self, and go out and practice the things that we want to develop for ourselves. Okay. So now we've come to the end of the three major approaches that I talked about before of approaching what's called normative ethics, or approaching the question of, what is the right thing to do, right? if there are moral facts, well, what are these facts? Well, we've seen three approaches to that. We've seen the utilitarian approach, which says that we should do whatever promotes the greatest good for the greatest number. We've seen Kant's approach that you should always act in accordance with the categorical imperative. And that means always respecting the full value of your fellow human beings, never ever taking advantage of them in any way, especially without their consent. And Aristotle's approach is, we should always do what is in accordance with virtue. That is, we should always do what a good person would do in a situation and try to be our best possible selves. Act according to the character traits that we admire. So now let's apply this to a couple situations. So on the issue of lying, for instance, let's go to that one real quick. So would a good person ever tell a lie? Let's walk through the three ways of thinking about this question. Well, on the utilitarian, what would a utilitarian say about this question? Does a good person lie sometimes? Well, for John Stuart Mill, lying is it's not a thing to make a habit of, right? But for Mill, if through a lie, you're going to achieve some greater happiness and diminish some pain, and there's no other way to do it, then Mill would be like, yeah, go ahead and lie, right? So for Kant, as we talked about, Kant says infamously, he says, no, we may never lie, not even once under any circumstances, right? As we talked about in the Kant lecture, there are some modern Kantians who think we can finesse that a little bit, and that Kant was just too fussy about the issue of lying, keeping promises. But for Kant himself, he says, no, any version of active lying fails both versions of the categorical imperative, right?
Married.
Good question. Was Kant married? That comes up a lot. Surprise, surprise, Kant was a bachelor for his entire life. So anyway, the third approach is Aristotle. And from Aristotle's perspective, what do you think? Reflect for a moment. On Aristotle's approach, would a good person ever lie? I think the answer to this is maybe sometimes, right? Sometimes a good person is going to tell a lie if lying is the right thing to do, right? If the lie is very important. So in the Anne Frank scenario, for instance, it's hard to imagine a good person in the Aristotelian sense. Somebody who has this deep and abiding love for human beings and always wants to be the best version of himself and wants to inspire others. It's hard to imagine that person simply saying to the Gestapo, "Yeah, go upstairs," right? Out of some Kantian duty that we have to some abstract moral principle, right? It seems like Aristotle would have none of that. Yeah, sure. Sometimes a good person is going to lie. In fact, for Aristotle, sometimes a good person might might do some bad acts. What seem, depending on the situation, might seem in other situations like bad acts. Some people who approach some modern interpreters of Aristotle's theory think that it implies that we can't. Not only are there no moral principles, but that we can never, ever make any sort of moral judgments without a pretty detailed analysis of the exact circumstances in which the decision is being made. This position is sometimes called particularism, right? Because you have to know the particular situation, right? So that's sort of a modern spin on some of Aristotle's theories. So another application of the three different ways of moral decision making we've talked about. Imagine this scenario. You're a sheriff in the Old West. You have somebody in your jail you know to be innocent of a crime, but there's an angry mob gathering outside. They think the guy is guilty and they would like to lynch him, right? You know that if you don't turn the innocent man over to the angry mob, the mob is going to go start a riot on the other side of town. They're going to burn down half the town, and 50 innocent people are going to die, women and children included. Right. So you have this moral dilemma. Do you turn the innocent man over to the mob to keep them from starting a riot and killing 50 innocent people? Or do you keep the man in jail, safe with you in jail, and do your best to stop the mob from doing their bad business outside, but don't turn the innocent man over, and if that means that 50 people die, well, you didn't do it. That's not your fault, right? So, what do we think about the three approaches in this situation? We already talked about the first one. If you're say in your jail, you have Deputy John Stuart Mill, right, and the utilitarian. What advice do you think he would give? And as we've said, well, the utilitarian math on this appears to be pretty simple. It's 1 life versus 50 lives. Out you go, right? Now, of course, utilitarians would love to save 51 lives. They would love to keep from having to sacrifice the man. But if the dilemma is airtight and you've really set it up so that there's no third option, well, then there's no third option, right? In fact, there's no second option for the utilitarian. It's 1 life versus 50 lives. Now, what do we think that Kant would say in this scenario? Say that you have Deputy Immanuel Kant. What advice do you think that he would give, and why? Pause to think about that. Here's where I would take hands and give a second for hands in class. So Kant's advice would clearly be that we may not sacrifice the man, right? And do you see why? Well, look in particular at the second version of the categorical imperative, the practical law, or the formula of the end in itself. According to that, we can never ever use another human being as a mere means, which means, among other things, we may never use that person without his consent. As I've said before, the prisoner here is not volunteering to go out to the mob. So you would have to drag him out there, right? You would have to sacrifice him without his consent. And that is directly what Kant says we may never do under any circumstances. It doesn't matter if 50 people die. It doesn't matter if 1 million people die. It doesn't matter if every human being in the world dies. You may not use another rational being in that way. Rather, everybody die, and not one person be used in this illegitimate way, right? Now to Aristotle. You have a third deputy, Deputy Aristotle. What advice do we think Aristotle would give? Let that wash over you for a second. It's hard to say, right? Aristotle's advice would be, well, what does a good his most straightforward advice would be, well, do what a good person would do in this situation, right? That doesn't really help us in this situation, right? My question is, what does a good person do in this situation? I don't know. I'm baffled, right? Look to a role model. Well, I don't know anybody who's been in this situation before. It seems unique, right? Do what is courageous. Do what is kind. Act according to your duties as a lawman. Well, again, it's not really clear what the reason that this particular dilemma is so provocative is that it cuts to the question of, well, what does it mean to be courageous and to live up to my duties in this situation, and so on, right? What does it mean to apply justice in this situation? What does justice demand in this situation, right? Now this is at the point at which utilitarians and Kantians go, aha, we have you, Aristotle. See, your theory doesn't stand on its own. You need our help. You might, okay, great, as the general sort of self-help advice of, do what a good person would do, right? But, when it comes to specific moments of decision-making, you need the help of the Kantian system or the utilitarian system, right? Aristotelians, modern defenders of Aristotle's theory, they have a different take on these kinds of dilemmas. Aristotelians hate these kinds of dilemmas, not just because they don't have a straightforward answer, but because they think that the dice are loaded here. They think that, well, what you've done here is you've set up a dilemma, given me two options, the Aristotelian option and the Kantian option and the utilitarian option, and then you're going to complain about my theory because I don't have a third option, right? So that doesn't seem fair to the Aristotelian. The Aristotelian is likely to point out that in real-world situations don't come with two flavors, right? Mill or Kant. In real-world situations, when I asked this question about the Old West Sheriff in class, and I say these are your two options, 9 times out of 10, the first hand that goes up is to try to think of a third option. Well, maybe I could go out and I give a passionate speech to the crowd to try to convince them about the nature of justice, right? Or maybe I try to sneak the man back out the back way. Or maybe I go out and I try to sacrifice myself. Hey, if you want to hang somebody, hang me. I confess to the crime. How about that, right? And what I do on the first day of classes, and I just shame those people who try to come up with a third way. I say, no, stop that. I gave you two choices. Pick a side, right? But now the Aristotelians will insist we do talk about a third option, because those are exactly the kinds of options that Aristotle would be interested in. And think about it. Think about our fiction. How many times have we seen Spider-Man or an action here, Arnold Schwarzenegger in a movie, right? In a situation where he's got two options, this terrible option or this terrible option. And what does a hero do? A hero comes up with that third option. A hero thinks of something, right? Batman is going to think of something. When the Joker gives him two options, Batman's going to come up with a third option, right? That's kind of the definition of a hero. So from the Aristotelian perspective, to handcuff us and to keep us from even trying to think of a third option in a bad situation like this is to basically begin this conversation with no entry point for the Aristotelian, right? So that is then, I believe, the conclusion of my Aristotle lecture. Thank you for playing along. I'm sorry about the complexity of the release of this video, but I will get it out as soon as I can. Thanks.